In the wreckage of a broken world, silence is never truly empty. It is a heavy, pressurized thing, filled with the echoes of what was lost and the fearful static of what might come next. After the fall of the unseen judge, the High Counselor's peace had transitioned from a sterile order into a desperate, vibrating paranoia. Metropolis remained a city of glass and steel, but its heart was cold, its citizens looking at their own reflections with a newfound suspicion. They had seen a god bleed from a pen stroke, and that knowledge had curdled the collective soul of humanity. To Superman, the shards of the Death Note weren't just remnants of a magical weapon. They were the seeds of a rebellion he couldn't punch, a heresy that suggested his strength was a finite, fragile thing. He had ordered the cursed ice to be contained in the deepest vaults of the Fortress of Solitude. But magic, true primordial magic, does not obey the laws of physics or the mandates of tyrants. It migrates. It seeks a host. It waits for the right hand to pick up the pieces. Deep beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in a containment facility known as the Trench, Light Yagami sat in a cell that was a masterpiece of sensory deprivation. There were no windows, no clocks, and no sounds save for the rhythmic, artificial hum of the life support systems. The walls were lead-lined and reinforced with nth metal, designed to block telepathy, X-ray vision, and mystical scrying. He was allowed no books, no screens, and certainly no writing utensils. To the insurgency, he was the world's most dangerous prisoner, a boy who could kill with a thought. To himself, he was a god in exile, his mind a vast echoing cathedral where he replayed every stroke of the pen, every heartbeat of his victims, over and over again. "You're twitching again, Light," a voice whispered, though there was no one in the room. Light didn't look up. He knew Ryok was gone, his connection to this realm shattered with the notebook. The voice was a memory, a ghost of his own ego. He held his right hand as if it still gripped a pen, his fingers moving in the rhythmic, elegant motion of a calligrapher. He was writing on the air, tracing the names of the guards, the heroes, the world. He was practicing for the day the ink returned. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Outside the cell, the guard on duty, a veteran of the Gotham Civil Wars named Miller, the brother of the man Light had used in the Hall of Justice, watched the monitor with a mixture of loathing and fascination. He saw the unseen judge as a monster, but he also saw the way crime had spiked in the months since Kira's disappearance. The regime's patrols were brutal, but they were predictable. Kira had been a shadow that lived in the conscience. Miller found himself looking at the blank paper of his own reports, wondering if the world wouldn't be better if the boy in the cell just had one more page. Meanwhile, at a restricted research facility in the ruins of LexCorp, the fragments of the Death Note were being analyzed by a mind that refused to stay dead. Though Superman believed the notebook was destroyed, a Luxor contingency had been triggered the moment the Fortress of Solitude sensors detected the magical discharge. A high-level subroutine, an AI backup of Lex Luthor's cognitive patterns, had redirected a portion of the shards during the transport. These pieces weren't ice anymore. They had thawed into a substance that defied chemical analysis, a crystalline, obsidian-like material that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic ultraviolet glow. Remarkable, the synthesized voice of Lex Lecker through the sterile laboratory. It doesn't respond to thermal energy or electromagnetic pulses, but look at the resonance when we introduce a localized emotional field. Cyborg, acting as the regime's liaison to the scientific project, stood over the containment field. His mechanical eye whirred, zooming in on a sliver of the black crystal. It's drawing energy from the air, Lex. Not solar energy, not electricity. It's feeding on intent. To demonstrate, Luxor's AI activated a localized willpower generator, a device reverse-engineered from captured Green Lantern rings. As the emerald energy bathed the shards, the crystals remained dormant, but when the AI switched the frequency to simulate the yellow light of fear, the primary tool of Superman's regime, the shards reacted violently. They didn't just glow, they began to vibrate at a frequency that shattered the nearby reinforced glass. The black material began to soften, turning back into a viscous, ink-like fluid that crawled toward the nearest human technician. It responds to the emotional spectrum, Cyborg noted, his internal mother box pinging with an urgent warning. But it doesn't want to be used, it wants to be expressed. This isn't just paper, Lex. It's a sentient medium. It's the physical manifestation of the concept of the end. Exactly, Luxor's AI replied, the tone one of chilling excitement. Superman thinks he ended Kira by breaking the book. He didn't realize that by shattering the medium, he released the message. The essence of the Death Note is now airborne, Victor. It's looking for a new script. And if my calculations are correct, the original user, Yagami, is acting as a beacon for these fragments, even from the bottom of the ocean. In his cell, Light Yagami stopped writing on the air. He tilted his head. His eyes, once dull and sunken, suddenly flared with a sharp, predatory light. He could feel it, a pull in the center of his chest, a magnetic resonance that felt like the cold touch of a Shinigami's hand. The shards were calling to him, seeking to reform the Covenant. He looked at the camera, knowing Batman was likely watching from some shadow, and he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a student, or even the smile of a killer. It was the smile of a man who realized that in a world of superheroes, the only thing more powerful than a god is a god who has returned from the grave. "Bruce," Light whispered, his voice crocking from months of silence. "You broke the pen, but you forgot. I and the ink." Thousands of miles away, in a forgotten corner of the Gotham Narrows, a young woman who had lost her family to a regime pacification squad found a small black sliver of glass embedded in the wall of her bombed-out apartment. As she touched it, the shard didn't cut her. It melted into her skin, turning her veins black for a fleeting second before vanishing. She looked at the wall, and for the first time in her life, she didn't see the rubble. She saw the name of the officer who had pulled the trigger, hovering in the air like a glowing golden brand. The Death Note had not been destroyed. It had been democratized. The shards were finding those with the most willpower, the most fear, and the most rage. The unseen judge was no longer a single man in a dorm room. Kira was becoming a collective, a viral judgment that threatened to tear the injustice universe apart from the inside out. As Superman prepared to consolidate his power for the infinite peace, he had no idea that the very ground he walked on was being rewritten, name by name, shard by shard.
Elena's fingers were stained a deep, bruised purple, an ink that wouldn't wash off no matter how hard she scrubbed with the gray, grit-filled water of the Narrows. The shard she had found wasn't just a piece of glass. It was a hungry thing. Every time she touched it, her mind filled with a cacophony of names. Not just random names, but the labels of those who had participated in the pacification of Sector 4. She saw their faces in the condensation on her window, and their identities hovered in the air like a digital HUD projected directly onto her retinas. The Death Note had been a formal contract, a judge's ledger. The shards, however, were raw vengeance. Elena didn't have Light Yagami's cold, intellectual detachment. She had a hole in her heart where a family used to be, and the shard provided the perfect shape to fill it. She sat on a milk crate in her ruined kitchen, a piece of yellowed propaganda paper from the regime smoothed out before her. With a trembling hand, she used the sharp edge of the black shard to carve a name into the paper. Captain Marcus Vane. He was the man who had ordered the structural demolition of her apartment block while the families were still inside, citing insurgent infestation. As the last letter was etched, the paper didn't just hold the ink. It began to smolder, a faint wisp of black smoke rising from the name. 5 miles away, at a high-security regime checkpoint, Captain Vane was enjoying a rare moment of quiet. He stepped out of his armored transport to light a cigarette, looking over the compliant, fearful faces of the Gotham citizens. Suddenly, his eyes rolled back. He didn't clutch his chest in a clean heart attack. Instead, his service weapon, a heavy-duty pulse pistol, discharged on its own, the magnetic rail firing a bolt directly through his own skull. It was a glitch, a tragic equipment failure that the regime's technicians would find impossible to explain. In the Batcave, the Kira alert sensors didn't just beep, they screamed. Bruce Wayne sat at the primary console, his face illuminated by a dozen flickering windows of police band data and satellite imagery. Beside him, John Constantine leaned against a stalagmite, the embers of a silk-cut cigarette glowing in the gloom. The occult detective looked more haggard than usual, his trench coat smelling of sulfur and damp alleyways. "I told you, mate," Constantine said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You can't just freeze a soul contract with a bit of chilly breath and expect it to go away. That book was a tether to the Shinigami Realm, a cosmic anchor. When your big blue Boy Scout shattered it, he didn't destroy the power, he shattered the container. Now the eldritch ink is out in the wild, looking for a way to write its own ending." "The deaths are different this time, John," Batman said, his fingers flying across the keys. Light was calculated. He used heart attacks to establish a signature, a brand of divine judgment. These new deaths, suicides, equipment failures, freak accidents, they're chaotic. There's no pattern to the victims other than a shared history of brutality in the Gotham Narrows.
That's because it's not a surgeon holding the knife anymore, Constantine replied, blowing a plume of smoke toward the ceiling. It's a riot. Those shards act like psychic tuning forks. They find people with enough grief and rage to resonate and give them a direct line to the Reaper. It's the democratization of death, Bruce. And in a world run by a Kryptonian tyrant, there's a hell of a lot of people looking to cast a vote. Batman pulled up a thermal scan of the Narrows. We need to find the source. If these shards are spreading, the body count will escalate beyond anything the regime can handle. Superman's response won't be an investigation. It will be a purge. He's already started, Constantine noted, gesturing to a newsfeed. In the Fortress of Solitude, Superman stood before a massive holographic map of Gotham. Beside him was Sinestro, the former Green Lantern who had become the regime's primary enforcer of fear. Sinestro's yellow power ring was pulsing with a rhythmic, anxious light. Can you feel it, Kal-El? Sinestro asked, his voice smooth and cold. The fear in Gotham isn't directed at us anymore. It's directed at the air itself. The citizens are terrified that their past sins will catch up to them in the form of a glitch. This is a disruption of the order we've built, a rival fear. Superman's jaw was set, his eyes glowing with a faint, dangerous crimson. Light Yagami is locked in the deepest cell on Earth. He has no contact with the outside world. How is this happening? The boy was a catalyst, but the power was ancient, Sinestro said, circling the High Counselor like a predator. You tried to break a god's weapon with physical force. It was a mistake, but it's a mistake we can utilize. My ring can sense the resonance of these shards. They vibrate at the frequency of terror. If you allow me to lead a division of my cores into Gotham, I can harvest these fragments before they become a wildfire. Superman looked at the map. He could feel his control slipping. The infinite peace required absolute certainty, and Kira was a variable that introduced doubt. Do it, Superman commanded. But I want the shards brought to me. If they respond to fear, then they belong to the regime. We will be the ones who decide who the end comes for. Deep beneath the Pacific, Light Yagami was no longer the catatonic prisoner the insurgency thought he was. He was standing in the center of his cell, his eyes fixed on his guard, Miller. He had spent weeks studying him, breaking down his psyche through subtle psychological warfare. He knew Miller's guilt over his brother's death. He knew Miller's secret resentment of the insurgency's failures. They're dying again, aren't they, Miller? Light asked, his voice a soft, hypnotic lure. The ones who did the real damage, the ones Superman protected with his regime, and Batman protected with his no-kill rule. They're finally getting what they deserve. Miller looked at the monitor, his hand trembling on his holster. How do you know that? You haven't had a single outside communication. I don't need to hear the news to know the sound of justice, Light said, stepping closer to the glass. The shards are active. I can feel them in my blood. They're looking for a leader, Miller. They're looking for the mind that knows how to use them to build a world, not just burn one. Light leaned his forehead against the reinforced transparency. The insurgency keeps you here in the dark, guarding a monster because they're afraid of the truth. But I'm the only one who can stop the chaos. I'm the only one who can harness the shards and turn them back into a tool of order. If you let me out, I can save Gotham. I can save the world from the monsters Superman has created. Miller looked into Light's eyes, the eyes of a boy who had looked into the void and decided he liked the view. For a moment, the guard didn't see a prisoner. He saw a messiah. What do you need? Miller whispered. Light smiled, a cold, sharp expression that didn't reach his eyes. Just a pen, Miller, and a way to the surface. The second coming of Kira has begun, and this time there won't be any mercy for the gods.
The trench was a tomb of high-pressure steel, but to Light Yagami, it had become a cathedral. He didn't need the physical notebook to feel the pulse of the world. The shards were vibrating in the collective unconscious of the planet, and as the original host, he was the receiver for every jagged frequency of death. He sat on the floor of his cell, his eyes closed, mapping the deaths in Gotham through pure intuition. He could feel Elena's rage in the Narrows. He could feel the sudden, sharp spike of terror as Sinestro's core descended upon the city. The yellow light of fear was a feast for the shards, a banquet of psychic energy that allowed the eldritch ink to manifest with terrifying speed. The Vanguard didn't die when you locked me away, Miller, Light said, his voice echoing in the small chamber. It just went underground. It became a faith, and a faith doesn't need a leader to be present. It only needs a symbol. Miller stood by the control panel, his hand hovering over the release cycle. He looked at the monitors, which showed the escalating chaos in Gotham. Sinestro's lanterns were sweeping the streets with yellow beams, incinerating anyone they suspected of harboring a shard. The regime wasn't just investigating, they were harvesting. They were executing citizens to reclaim the property of the High Counselor. Batman told us you were a monster, Miller whispered, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He said you were a virus that would destroy the very idea of justice. But look at what's happening out there. Superman is burning the city to find the ink. If you're the monster, what does that make him? He's a god who has forgotten how to be a man, Light replied, standing up with a fluid, terrifying grace. And Batman is a man who thinks he can keep the gods in cages. Neither of them understands that the world doesn't want heroes anymore. It wants a finality. It wants the peace of the end. Light stepped toward the glass, his reflection merging with Miller's on the reinforced surface. The Vanguard is waiting for me, Miller. They have infiltrated the regime's communications, the insurgency's logistics, and even the staff of this very prison. Why do you think the sensors in this sector have been looping for the last 10 minutes? Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at the status lights. They were green, indicating a normal patrol cycle, but the timestamps were frozen. Who did this? I did, a voice came over the internal comms. It wasn't the gravel of Batman or the synthesize of Cyborg. It was the crisp, disciplined tone of a young woman, a member of the original Global Vanguard, who had hidden in plain sight as a digital technician for the insurgency. Sector 4 is dark light. The submersible is prepped in the moon pool. We have the Master Shard. Light looked at Miller. The choice is yours. You can stay here and wait for Superman to find out you let me speak, or you can come with me and see the world reborn. My Vanguard doesn't follow a man. They follow a god who cannot be silenced. We are the new order, Miller, the only order that actually works. With a trembling hand, Miller entered the manual override code. The heavy promethium doors hissed open, the seal of the trench breaking for the first time in months. Light walked out, his stride confident, his eyes already scanning the hallway for the tactical advantages he would need. He wasn't just escaping, he was reclaiming his throne. In the skies over Gotham, the atmosphere was thick with the acrid smell of ozone and the sickly yellow glow of the Sinestro core. Sinestro himself floated above the Narrows, his ring projecting a massive, translucent dome over the district. Below him, his lanterns were dragging people from their homes, anyone whose biometric scan showed the black ink resonance. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Sinestro asked as Superman descended beside him. "The way they cling to these shards, they think it's a weapon of liberation. They don't realize it's a leash. The more they fear the death the shards bring, the more power my ring draws from them. The Kira energy is the perfect fuel for our regime." Superman looked down at a group of citizens being herded into a transport. He saw a young woman, Elena, clutching a piece of paper, her eyes burning with a defiance that even his presence couldn't quell. "They aren't afraid of us, Sinestro. They're obsessed. They've turned Kira into a religion." "Then we will give them a crusade," Superman said, his voice dropping into a register of cold finality. "If they want to worship death, they can find it at my hand. We will collect every shard, every drop of that ink, and we will forge it into a single ultimate decree, a note that only I can write." Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the Gotham harbor. A high-speed submersible breached the surface, its hull painted a matte black, unmarked save for a single crimson K on the tower. From the deck, a figure emerged, thin, pale, and dressed in a simple suit that looked jarringly mundane against the backdrop of superpowered warfare. Light Yagami looked up at the two gods in the sky. He held a long, crystalline staff tipped with a massive obsidian shard, the Master Shard that had been salvaged from the ruins of the Hall of Justice. "Superman!" Light's voice was amplified by the Vanguard's hijacked speakers, echoing through the city like thunder. "You shattered the book because you feared the truth. You thought you could bury the judge in the dark, but a god doesn't die just because you break his altar." Light raised the staff. The obsidian shard began to glow with a dark violet light that seemed to swallow the yellow energy of the Sinestro core. Across Gotham, every citizen who carried a shard felt a sudden, agonizing surge of connection. Their veins turned black, their eyes reflecting the violet glow of the Master Shard. They weren't just individuals anymore. They were a network, a collective Kira. "He's turned them into conduits," Batman whispered from the shadows of a nearby rooftop, Constantine standing beside him. The occult detective was frantically sketching a protective circle in the dust. "It's worse than that, Bruce," Constantine said, his eyes wide with horror. "He's not just using their rage, he's using their souls as a distributed processor. He's building a death note out of the people themselves. He doesn't need paper anymore. He has the city." In the sky, Sinestro sneered, his ring flaring with enough power to level a mountain. "A boy with a stick.
You think a few shards can challenge the might of the cores? Sinestro fired a beam of pure yellow fear at the submersible, but as the energy hit the violet field around Light, it didn't explode. It was absorbed. Light's staff pulsed, and for a second, the names of every Sinestro lantern in the sky appeared in the air, written in violet ink. I don't need to challenge you, Sinestro, Light said, his face a mask of chilling, divine confidence. I just need to know your names, and in this universe, everyone's name is already written in the Book of Destiny. I'm just the one who decides when to close the cover. The violet ink flared, and in the sky, 3 Sinestro lanterns suddenly clutched their chests, their yellow rings sputtering and dying as their hearts stopped in perfect unison. They fell from the sky like lead weights, their bodies crashing into the harbor. Light Yagami, the resurrected Kira, looked at the horrified faces of the gods above him. The vanguard has risen, and this time the judgment won't be silent. It will be absolute.
The 3 yellow rings clattered against the damp concrete of the pier, their once vibrant glow sputtering like dying embers before fading into a dull, leaden gray. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the rhythmic lapping of the harbor water against the hull of the Vanguard's submersible. Above, the sky was a bruised canvas of gold and violet, the atmospheric tension so thick it felt as though the air itself might shatter. Superman hung suspended in the air, his cape a frozen river of crimson. He didn't look at the fallen lanterns. His eyes were fixed entirely on the pale young man standing on the deck below. For the first time since the Metropolis explosion, the High Counselor felt a sensation he had buried under layers of steel and decree, the cold, creeping itch of uncertainty. This wasn't a physical threat he could fly through. This was a conceptual breach. You should have stayed in the dark, Light. Superman's voice was a low, vibrating growl that caused the water around the sub to ripple in concentric circles. Every moment you breathe is an insult to the peace I have built. You aren't a judge. You're a parasite, feeding on the fear of people who just want to be safe. Light Yagami didn't flinch. He leaned against his crystalline staff, the master shard at its tip pulsing with a rhythmic heartbeat like violet light. Safe? Is that what you call this, Clark? Herding them like cattle? Executing them because they found a piece of the truth you tried to bury? You didn't bring peace. You brought a silence so loud that people are willing to die just to hear a different voice. I am that voice. Besides Superman, Sinestro's face was a mask of aristocratic fury. His ring hand was trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer biological rejection of the energy Light was emitting. He's a scavenger, Kal-El. He's using the black ink resonance to hijack the fear my core has cultivated. He isn't generating his own power. He's a lightning rod for the terror you've spent 5 years perfecting. He's using your regime as his inkwell. Sinestro turned to Superman, his yellow eyes burning with a strategic desperation. We cannot fight him with brute force. His staff is acting as a dampener, a void that eats through our energy constructs, but there is a way to overwhelm him. The shards respond to the emotional spectrum. If you want to stop a ghost that feeds on fear, you must become the absolute master of that fear. Sinestro held out his hand, a second yellow power ring, forged in the heart of Quard and fueled by the collective terror of 1 billion souls, materialized in the air. It didn't float, it sought out Superman, circling his finger like a shark sensing blood. Put it on, Kal-El. Become the yellow lantern of Sector 2814. With your Kryptonian willpower and the ring's mastery of fear, you won't just see his names. You will see the very fabric of the reality he's trying to rewrite. You will become the light that no shadow can escape. Down on the rooftop, Batman watched the exchange through a high-powered thermal scope. He's doing it, John. Sinestro is offering him the ring. If Superman joins the Corps, Kira won't be the only one writing the ending of this world. It's a race to the bottom of the abyss, Bruce, Constantine muttered, his hands moving in a blur as he wove a concealment spell around them. The air shimmered, turning them into a smudge of nothingness against the Gotham skyline. You've got a boy god who's turned the city into a sentient death note, and an alien god who's about to become the literal avatar of terror. If either of them wins, the injustice won't just be a name for your little rebellion. It'll be the only law left in the multiverse.
"We need to disrupt the connection," Batman said, his voice a steel rasp. "Light is using the Vanguard as a distributed network. If we can knock out the city's cellular and satellite relays, we might be able to desync the shards long enough to get close to that staff." "It won't be enough," Constantine countered. "Light isn't using satellites, mate. He's using souls. He's tethered his mind to the grief of every person in the Narrows who's lost a loved one to the regime. That's a biological network. To shut him down, you'd have to shut down their hearts." Back at the harbor, the yellow ring finally slid onto Superman's finger. The transformation was instantaneous and violent. A pillar of blinding yellow light erupted from the High Counselor, a shockwave of pure terror that knocked the hovering lanterns out of the sky and shattered the windows of every skyscraper for 10 blocks. When the light faded, the Man of Steel was gone. In his place stood a figure in obsidian and gold armor, the S on his chest glowing with a sickly, incandescent yellow. His eyes were no longer blue or even red. They were pits of burning amber fire. Superman looked down at his hands, feeling the ring interface with his Kryptonian physiology. He didn't just see the harbor. He saw the ley lines of fear connecting Light Yagami to the thousands of shards scattered across Gotham. He saw the names Light was projecting, a shimmering violet lattice of death intent. "I see you now, Kira." Superman's voice was no longer human. It was a chorus of a billion screams, amplified by the power of the ring. Superman lunged. He didn't fly. He teleported through a tear in the emotional fabric of the city. He appeared directly in front of Light, his armored fist glowing with enough yellow energy to crack a planet's core. Light raised the Master Shard staff. The violet field flared to meet the yellow assault. The collision was a silent reality-warping thrum. The harbor water beneath the sub simply ceased to exist, replaced by a steaming, perfectly circular crater in the seabed. The Vanguard sub groaned, its hull buckling under the atmospheric pressure of two competing gods. "You're a hypocrite, Clark," Superman shouted, the strain of the Master Shard staff turning his face as pale as bone. "You claim to protect the people, but you've become the very Nightmare that used to tell stories about to stay safe. You aren't a hero. You're the ink I'm using to sign your death warrant." "The people don't want a hero, Clark," Superman roared, his yellow energy beginning to bleed through the violet shield. "They want a king who is strong enough to keep them from their own shadows, and a king doesn't die because a boy writes his name in the dirt." With a final, earth-shaking surge of willpower, Superman shattered the violet shield. The Master Shard staff cracked, a spiderweb of white fractures racing down the obsidian length. Light was thrown backwards, crashing into the sub's tower, his hand losing its grip on the staff. As the staff clattered to the deck, the violet names in the sky flickered and died. Across Gotham, the citizens who had been conduits for the black ink collapsed, their connections severed. Elena in her apartment fell to her knees. The black veins in her arms were seeding as the shard she held lost its glow. Superman landed on the deck, his yellow armor steaming. He reached down and picked up the cracked Master Shard staff, looking at it with a mixture of disgust and triumph. "The second coming is over, Light. You're not a god. You're just a ghost who forgot that the light always finds you." But as Superman prepared to crush the staff, Light Yagami began to laugh. It wasn't the manic laugh of a defeated villain. It was the calm, analytical chuckle of a player who had just realized his opponent had played right into his trap. "You really don't understand, do you?" Light whispered, blood trickling from his mouth. "The shards don't just respond to fear, Clark. They respond to identity. By putting on that ring, you didn't become stronger. You became specific. You're no longer the Man of Steel or the High Counselor. You have fully embraced the identity of the Yellow Lantern." Light pointed a trembling finger at the sky. Above them, a second figure was descending. It wasn't a hero, and it wasn't a god. It was a woman in a tattered gray dress, her eyes glowing with a dull leaden gray. She held a second notebook, not black, but a stark, clinical white. "Meet Rem," Light said, his voice filled with a chilling, final victory. "She's been waiting for you to choose a side, Clark, because in this universe, even a god has a name, and now that you've put on that ring, you've finally given her the face she needs to finish the story."
The descent of Rem was not a violent entry. It was a slow, agonizing bleed of gray into a world of vibrant, terrifying gold. Unlike Ryuk, who moved with a frantic, bored energy, Rem drifted through the air with a heavy, mournful grace. Her skin looked like weathered bone, and her eyes were twin pits of leaden light that seemed to weigh the very air around them. The white notebook she held was not a tool of creation, despite its pristine color. It was the eraser's ledger, a conceptual weapon that didn't just end a life, but sought to reconcile the injustice of an immortal soul that refused to leave the cycle. To Superman,
now the avatar of the yellow light. She looked like a glitch in his new omniscience, a shadow that his ring couldn't illuminate. "Identity is a cage, Kal-El," Light Yagami whispered, pulling himself up against the sub's tower, his breath hitching in his chest. "You thought the ring gave you the power to see everything, but in this universe, when you look into the abyss of fear, the abyss marks you. You've stopped being a man, and you've stopped being a god. You are now a frequency, and every frequency has a resonance that can be cancelled out." Superman turned his amber gaze toward Rem, his yellow armor crackling with enough energy to ignite the atmosphere. "I don't care what color the book is," he roared, the voice of a billion terrified souls echoing in his throat. "I have dismantled the multiverse's greatest threats. I have killed gods of war and lords of chaos. I will not be judged by a ghost in a tattered dress." He lunged at Rem, his armored fist trailing a wake of incandescent yellow fire. But as he struck, his hand didn't meet bone or muscle. It passed through her like smoke through a screen. Rem didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the attack. She simply opened the white notebook, her long skeletal fingers tracing a line of script that shimmered with a pale, cold light. "The yellow lantern of Sector 2814. Rem's voice was a soft, hollow chime that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the soul. A soul defined by the terror it inflicts, a story that has outgrown its page. To protect the balance, the anchor must be lifted." Across the harbor, on the rooftop obscured by mystical shadows, John Constantine dropped his cigarette into the grime. His hands, usually steady even in the face of Hell's princes, were shaking as he gripped his worn trench coat. "Blimey, Bruce, that's not a death note. That's a null note. It's the Shinigami's way of pruning a reality that's become too bloated with its own ego. If she writes his name in that, she won't just kill him. She'll erase the concept of Superman from the timeline. Every statue, every law, every memory of the man of tomorrow, it'll all just unravel into gray mist." "I won't let that happen," Batman said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "The regime is a nightmare, but erasing the history of what Clark was, that's a different kind of death. We can't fight a Shinigami here, not with physical weapons." "You're right about that, mate," Constantine replied, his eyes darting toward the violet and gold clash in the sky. "We're fighting the symptom. The disease is the tether. Light is the anchor keeping these ghosts in our reality, but the source of the ink isn't here. It's in a parasitic pocket dimension that's been feeding on our multiverse's grief since the first crisis." Constantine pulled a small, jagged shard of the black obsidian from his pocket, the piece he had acquired from the Hall of Justice ruins. He held it up, and the shard began to vibrate in sympathy with Rem's presence. "If we want to close the book, we have to go to the library. We need to enter the Shinigami Realm and sever the contract at the root. But I can't get us there alone. I need a soul that's experienced the end and refused to blink. I need a heart that's already a graveyard." Batman looked at the shard, then at the chaos unfolding over the harbor. Superman was now frantically firing beams of yellow fear energy at Rem, each blast passing through her harmlessly while she continued to write, her pen moving with a slow, inevitable rhythm. Light Yagami sat on the deck of the sub, a bloody smile on his face, watching the god of fear struggle against the god of silence. "Do it," Batman commanded. Constantine began the ritual, his voice chanting in an ancient gutter tongue that made the shadows around them writhe like wounded animals. He pressed the black shard into Batman's chest, over the bat insignia. The nth metal in Bruce's armor reacted violently, sparking with a dark, necrotic energy. The air around them didn't just tear, it curdled, turning into a gray, ash-filled vortex that smelled of dry earth and stagnant water. "Hold on, Bruce," Constantine shouted over the roar of the interdimensional rift. "It's not going to be pretty. The Shinigami Realm is where stories go to die. It's a desert of discarded identities and forgotten names." With a final bone-chilling crack, the two of them were pulled into the vortex. They vanished from Gotham, leaving behind a world caught in the grip of two competing apocalypses. They landed hard on a surface that felt like pulverized bone. The sky was a uniform, suffocating gray, devoid of sun, moon, or stars. The landscape was a jagged horizon of gray towers that looked like fossilized ribs, and the only sound was the dry, rasping wind that carried the dust of 1 trillion dead names.
This was the Shinigami Realm, a wasteland of cosmic boredom where the gods of death gambled with the remaining seconds of human lives. "Welcome to the end of the line," Constantine said, pushing himself up and dusting off his coat. He looked around at the spindly, grotesque figures of other Shinigamis sitting upon the bone towers, their yellow eyes watching the newcomers with a flick of mild predatory interest. "Most people come here and forget their own names within 5 minutes. The air here is pure apathy, Bruce. It eats through your will like acid." Batman stood up, his cape billowing in the stagnant wind. He felt the weight of the realm pressing against his mind, the collective grief of all the names ever written in a death note. He saw visions of his parents, of Jason Todd, of the millions who had died in Metropolis. The realm was trying to categorize him, to turn his trauma into just another entry in a dusty ledger. "Where is the contract?" Batman asked, his voice echoing in the vast empty space. "In the center of the rot," Constantine pointed toward a massive pulsing mass of black ink that looked like a heart made of oil, suspended between 2 towering pillars of human skulls. "That's the primal inkwell. Every death note ever dropped into a mortal realm is fed from that pool. It's the conceptual heart of the Shinigami's power. If we can introduce a catalyst, something that represents an absolute, unshakable refusal to die, we can cause a feedback loop that will pull Rem and Ryuk back here and sever Light's connection." And the catalyst. Constantine looked at Batman, a rare expression of genuine sympathy on his face. "It's you, Bruce. You're the man who refuses. You've spent your whole life fighting a war you know you can't win, against enemies that are essentially concepts. Your will isn't just a force of personality, it's a cosmic anomaly. If you step into that ink and project the identity of the Batman, the realm won't be able to digest you. It'll choke on you." Batman looked at the pulsing heart of ink. He knew the cost. To enter the rot was to subject his mind to the unfiltered end of every being who had ever died. It was a psychic crucifixion. But he also knew that back in Gotham, Superman was seconds away from being erased, and Light Yagami was seconds away from becoming the architect of a world where life only existed at his whim. "Stay back, John," Batman said. His hands moved to his utility belt. He didn't pull out a gadget. He pulled off his mask. "Bruce, what are you doing?" Constantine asked, his eyes wide. "Identity is a cage," Bruce said, echoing Light Yagami's words from earlier. "But a mask is a choice. If the realm wants a name, I'll give it the only one that matters." Bruce Wayne stepped into the black ink. The moment his skin touched the liquid, the gray world vanished. He was plunged into a sea of screaming names, a tidal wave of every heart attack, every accidental fall, and every suicide the Death Note had ever authored. He felt his mind being torn apart, his memories of his parents being replaced by the memories of 1,000 strangers' final moments. But in the center of the storm, Bruce Wayne didn't scream. He didn't plead. He held onto the image of a bat crashing through a window. He held onto the promise he made in the blood of his family. He projected a single, unyielding thought into the heart of the Shinigami Realm. "I am not a name. I am a shadow. And shadows do not die." The rot began to boil. The gray towers shook. In Gotham, the white notebook in Rem's hand suddenly burst into gray flames. The violet names in the sky turned into black ash. Light Yagami fell to his knees on the substack, clutching his head as the master shard in his hand shattered into dust. The deal with the devil had been made, but as the Shinigami Realm began to collapse around them, Constantine realized that by choking the heart of death, Batman hadn't just saved the world, he had invited the rot into his own soul. The Dark Knight was no longer just a man in a suit. He was now the conduit for the very power he had sought to destroy.
The Shinigami Realm didn't just break, it inverted. The gray towers of bone liquefied into rivers of leaden ash, and the sky, a vast, featureless void, began to crack like a porcelain mask under too much pressure. At the center of this collapsing reality, Bruce Wayne stood submerged in the primal inkwell, his human form silhouetted against a swirling, necrotic vortex of black ink. He was no longer a man fighting a war. He was the center of a cosmic feedback loop. The rot was the sum total of every end ever authored, a conceptual poison that sought to categorize and discard everything it touched. But the Batman was an identity built on the refusal to be discarded. He was a symbol born from the trauma of an ending, a shadow that had learned to walk. As he projected his unyielding will into the ink, the realm found itself trying to digest a constant in a universe of variables.
Bruce, get out of there! John Constantine's voice was a frantic, distant, tinny sound, nearly swallowed by the roar of the entropic storm. The occult detective was gripping his chest, the black shard over his heart glowing with a blinding, agonizing heat. You've done it! The heart is seizing! The tethers are snapping! If you don't jump now, you're going to be the last name written in a book that's about to close forever. Bruce didn't move. He couldn't. His mind was a battlefield where the memories of Thomas and Martha Wayne were being used as shields against the psychic weight of 1,000,000,000,000 dead strangers. He felt the ink rushing into his veins, turning his blood into a cold, heavy sludge. His suit, the reinforced nth metal weave, was beginning to change, the gray and black fabric absorbing the necrotic energy, turning into a shifting liquid obsidian that seemed to drink the light. He wasn't just choking the heart of death, he was becoming its new vessel. Back in Gotham, the effect was cataclysmic. Rem, the Shinigami who had been seconds away from erasing Superman's concept from existence, suddenly jerked backward as if snagged by an invisible harpoon. Her white notebook disintegrated into a flurry of gray moths that vanished into the air. She let out a final hollow chime, not of anger, but of profound, mournful relief, as she was yanked through a jagged tear in reality, pulled back toward the collapsing source. Superman, still encased in the incandescent gold and black armor of a yellow lantern, stumbled back on the deck of the submersible. The null note threat was gone, but the sensation of being targeted by a conceptual eraser had left his mind fractured. The amber fire in his eyes flickered, his connection to the sinister corpse ring wavering as his focus shifted from the fear of his subjects to the primal fear of his own non-existence. It's over? Superman gasped, his voice a distorted chorus of fading screams. He looked at his hands, which were still glowing with the yellow light, but the light felt thin, brittle. Light Yagami sat in the ruins of the sub's tower, his fingers bleeding from where the master shard had shattered in his palm. He looked at the empty space where Rem had been, his face a mask of utter, hollowed-out despair. He had played the gods against each other. He had brought a Shinigami into the house of a Kryptonian king, and he had lost everything to a man who wasn't even in the city. He didn't kill me, Light whispered, a chilling, hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. He didn't even fight me. He went for the source. He went for the very idea of Kira. He looked up at the High Counselor, a flicker of his old, burning arrogance returning. You think you won, Clark? You think you're back in control? Look at the sky. Batman didn't just stop the book. He took the pen. As if in response to Light's words, the air over the harbor didn't just tear, it bled. A vertical slit of absolute darkness opened, a wound in the fabric of the universe that smelled of dry earth and stagnant water. From this shadow rift, a figure emerged. It was Batman, but he was no longer the Dark Knight the world knew. His cape didn't flow, it drifted like liquid smoke, expanding and contracting with a life of its own. His armor was a shifting, matte black plate that seemed to absorb the yellow glow of Superman's ring, but it was the face that was the most terrifying. The cowl was gone, replaced by a helmet of obsidian bone that mimicked the cowl's shape, and where the white lenses of his mask should have been, there was only a void of swirling, necrotic ink. He landed on the pier with a sound like a heavy stone hitting a graveyard. Constantine tumbled out of the rift behind him, looking like he'd been dragged through every circle of hell. He collapsed onto the concrete, coughing up gray ash. Don't look at him, Clark, Constantine wheezed. He's not Bruce anymore. He's the Death Knight. He's the anchor for the rot. Superman descended, his yellow armor flaring in a defensive posture. Bruce, what have you done to yourself? The figure that was Batman didn't speak with a human voice. When he opened his mouth, the sound was the rustle of 1,000 turning pages, the collective sigh of 1,000,000,000,000 dead breaths. Order requires a finality, the entity said, the words resonating in the soul rather than the ear. Light Yagami sought to be a judge, you sought to be a king, but I have seen the library, I have seen the end of every story. The obsidian bat raised a hand. He didn't have a notebook, he didn't have a pen, but as he gestured, the black ink resonance within Gotham didn't just react, it obeyed. Across the city, the shards embedded in the citizens began to vibrate in perfect unison. They didn't cause heart attacks, they didn't cause accidents, they simply deactivated. The power was being drawn back into the center, into Batman. You're a threat, Bruce, Superman said, his amber eyes hardening. The yellow ring on his finger pulsed with a sudden violent surge of fear, the fear of a tyrant who sees a rival, a power he cannot understand. You've become the very thing we fought to stop. You've let that darkness consume you. Fear is a symptom, Clark, the Death Knight replied, his form becoming larger, more imposing as he absorbed the city's necrotic energy. The Death Note was a symptom. The real disease is the refusal to let the cycle turn. You have held this world in a state of artificial stasis for 5 years. You have denied humanity its right to grow, to fail, and to eventually end. Superman lunged, a streak of incandescent yellow fire.
He struck Batman with enough force to level a mountain range, but the Death Knight didn't fly back. He dissolved into a cloud of black liquid ink, the yellow energy passing through him harmlessly before he reformed behind Superman. With a movement that was both slow and impossibly fast, Batman touched the back of Superman's yellow armor. The obsidian bone fingers didn't crush the metal, they simply left a mark, a single, black, ink-like smudge in the shape of a bat. "Kal-El," Batman whispered, the rustle of pages filling the air. "Your story is long. It is filled with light. But every story needs a period." Superman let out a scream of pure, biological terror. The yellow armor began to rust and crumble where Batman had touched it. The power of the sinister corpse ring flickered, the amber energy being drained into the black smudge. For the first time, the High Counselor felt the actual physical weight of his own mortality. He wasn't just losing a fight, he was losing his conceptual immortality. Light Yagami watched from the sub, his eyes wide as he saw the Batman doing what he had failed to do, truly judging a god. "He's not a hero," Light whispered, a look of horrific awe on his face. "He's the ultimate Kira. He's the one who doesn't just kill the man, he kills the myth." But as the Death Knight prepared to deliver the final strike, the rot within him flared. Batman's human heart, the piece of Bruce Wayne that still beat under the obsidian bone, let out a sharp, agonizing thud. The liquid smoke cape lashed out uncontrollably, shattering a nearby crane. "Bruce, fight it," John Constantine shouted, struggling to his feet. "You're not a concept, you're a man. If you let the rot win, you're not going to end the regime, you're going to end the world." The Death Knight froze, his obsidian hand inches from Superman's throat. The necrotic ancient, his eyes swirled violently, a battle of wills unfolding within the shadow. The world held its breath as the avatar of the end struggled against the man who refused to blink. The three-way war for the soul of the Injustice universe had reached its breaking point, and the ending was still being written in blood and black ink.
The harbor water didn't just splash against the pier, it recoiled, as if the very molecules of the ocean were repelled by the presence of the figure standing where Bruce Wayne once stood. The Death Knight was a silhouette of absolute negation, a hole in the reality of the Injustice universe. His cape didn't flow in the wind, it drifted like liquid smoke, expanding and contracting with a life of its own, trailing wisps of necrotic ash that dissolved before they hit the ground. His armor, once the gray and black of a detective, was now a shifting, matte black plate of obsidian bone that seemed to drink the light from the surrounding fires. But it was the face that was the most terrifying transformation. The cowl had merged with the skeletal architecture of the Shinigami Realm, and where the white lenses of his mask should have been, there were only twin voids of swirling violet-tinted ink. "The library is open, Clark," the entity said. The voice was no longer the gravelly rasp of the Batman. It was the rustle of 1,000 turning pages, the collective, tired sigh of every final breath ever taken in the history of the world. It was a sound that didn't travel through the air, but resonated directly within the soul, bypassing the eardrums of everyone on the pier. Superman, encased in the incandescent gold and black armor of the Yellow Lantern, stumbled back on the deck of the submersible. The amber fire in his eyes flickered, his connection to the Sinestro Corps ring wavering. For 5 years he had built a kingdom on the foundation of fear, believing himself to be the master of it. But the presence of the Death Knight wasn't fear, it was the source of it. It was the end that every living thing instinctively fled from. The yellow ring on his finger began to pulse a warning, a rapid, rhythmic chirping that signaled a catastrophic failure in the emotional spectrum interface. "Bruce, what have you done?" Superman's voice was a distorted chorus of fading screams. He lunged forward, a streak of blinding yellow energy, his fist aimed at the center of the obsidian bat's chest. "I won't let you become another monster. I won't let you drag this world into the dirt with you." The Death Knight didn't move to intercept. He didn't raise a shield or fire a gadget. He simply was. As Superman's fist struck the obsidian plate, there was no sound of impact, no shockwave. The yellow energy of the ring was simply absorbed, drawn into the matte black surface like water into parched earth. The Death Knight reached out a slow, deliberate hand and touched the High Counselor's shoulder. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The golden armor of the Yellow Lantern began to rust and crumble into gray dust at the point of contact. The amber light of the ring dimmed to a dull, sickly ochre. Superman let out a cry of pure biological terror as he felt his strength, his godlike Kryptonian vitality, being weighed and found wanting.
The rot wasn't just damaging him, it was reconciling his story. It was the conceptual weight of 5 years of tyranny, 5 years of denied mortality, suddenly catching up to the man who thought he had outrun fate. Identity is a cage, Kal-El, the Death Knight whispered, the ink in his eyes swirling faster. You chose the crown. You chose the ring. You chose to be the god of fear. And every god has a name. Every name has a period. On the deck of the sub, Light Yagami watched the confrontation with a look of horrific, ecstatic awe. His fingers were still bleeding, his master shard shattered, but his mind, the mind of the most ambitious judge in history, was racing. He saw the Batman doing what he had failed to do. He saw a Kira that didn't need a book, a Kira that had become the literal manifestation of the Reaper. He's beautiful, he whispered, a hysterical, chilling laugh bubbling in his throat. He's not a hero. He's the perfect ending. He's the Kira I was meant to be. Ryu, who had reappeared as the Shinigami Realm's collapse stabilized, hovered over Light, his yellow eyes wide. He's not a Kira, Lighto. He's the Death Knight. He's the anchor for the rot. And I've got to tell ya, even the old man in the realm never saw a soul that could hold that much ink without shattering. Your friend Bruce? He's built different. Down on the pier, John Constantine struggled to his feet, his trench coat scorched and his face ashen. He looked at the Death Knight, and then at the fading Superman. Bruce, stop it. Constantine's voice cracked the atmospheric pressure. You're not just killing him, you're draining the concept. If you take his life while you're tethered to the rod, you'll erase him from the collective memory. The world won't remember the hero. They'll only remember the ash. The Death Knight's hand tightened on Superman's shoulder. The High Counselor's eyes were wide, the amber light almost gone, replaced by a dull human fear. He looked at Bruce, really looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the tyrant was gone. Only Clark Kent remained, the man who had lost his home, his wife, and his way. Bruce, Clark whispered, the name a plea for a humanity that seemed miles away. The Death Knight froze. The liquid smoke of his cape lashed out, shattering the heavy crane nearby into splinters of rusted iron. Inside the obsidian armor, the human heart of Bruce Wayne let out a sharp, agonizing thud. The necrotic ink in his eyes flickered, a battle of wills unfolding within the shadow. The rot wanted the kill. It wanted the story to end. It wanted to categorize the High Counselor and move on to the next name. But Bruce Wayne, the boy who had stood in an alley and promised to protect life, refused to let go of the line. No, the entity said, the voice drifting back towards something resembling a human growl. The Death Knight shoved Superman away. The High Counselor crashed into the substack, the yellow ring finally shattering into golden shards that dissolved into the air. Superman lay there, gasping for breath, his powers depleted, his armor gone. He was just a man in a tattered blue suit, his identity laid bare and vulnerable. The Death Knight turned his gaze towards Light Yagami. The young man didn't flinch. He stood up, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the violet ink in the sky. What are you waiting for, Bruce? Finish it. You have the name. You have the power. Write the end of the regime. Write the end of the world. The Death Knight stepped toward Light. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand. But before he could act, a new signal flared in the sky. It wasn't a bat signal, and it wasn't a regime alert. It was a boom tube, a massive golden-white portal of cosmic energy that tore open the atmosphere over the harbor. From the portal, a figure descended. Not a Shinigami, and not a hero. It was Metron, the new god of knowledge, sitting upon his Mobius chair. His eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with the data of billion civilizations. The balance has been terminally disrupted. Metron's voice was a cold, synthesized chime. The introduction of the Shinigami variable has compromised the stability of this reality's timeline. The Death Knight is a paradox that cannot be allowed to remain in the physical plane. Metron looked at Light, then at the weakened Superman, and finally at the obsidian figure of Batman. The source demands a correction. The ink must return to the well, and the souls must return to their assigned paths. The new god raised a hand, and the Mobius chair hummed with a power that rivaled the rod. The struggle for the soul of the Injustice universe had just expanded. It was no longer a war between a student, a knight, and a king. It was a war against the cosmic order itself. And in the center of it all, Light Yagami saw one last chance to reclaim his pen.
The atmosphere didn't just crack, it dissolved.
The Mobius chair didn't merely hover, it existed in a state of perpetual arrival, a throne of cold, white-hot intelligence that made the smoldering ruins of the Gotham harbor look like primitive scratchings in the dirt. Metron sat encasing his armor of logic, his eyes shimmering with the blue-white data of 1,000 dead civilizations. To him, the injustice timeline was no longer a tragedy to be observed. It had become a malignant equation. The introduction of the Death Note, a foreign necrotic artifact, had cross-pollinated with the crisis-prone reality of the DC multiverse, creating a paradox that threatened the stability of the source itself. The anomaly must be purged, Metron stated, his voice a synthesized chime that vibrated through the very marrow of everyone on the pier. The Death Knight is a conceptual contradiction, a mortal who has swallowed the void. The Yellow Lantern is a failure of leadership, and the Kira is a bug in the system that has been allowed to iterate for too long. The Mobius chair hummed, a low-frequency pulse of Chronos energy that began to rewrite the local reality. The shadows around Batman, the liquid smoke of the rot, began to evaporate, the obsidian bone of his armor flickering as the chair attempted to revert him to a previous save state of his own history. Superman, lying weakened on the deck of the submersible, felt the golden white light of the new god's power begin to dissolve the last traces of the Yellow Ring's corruption. But it wasn't a healing process, it was a deletion. Metron wasn't saving them. He was preparing to format the entire sector to remove the Shinigami virus. "Bruce, he's doing a hard reset," John Constantine screamed, his voice barely audible over the cosmic roar of the chair's engines. The occult detective was frantically throwing handfuls of graveyard dirt into the air, trying to weave a protective sigil, but the magic of the new gods was beyond the reach of his usual parlor tricks. If he finishes that sequence, Gotham and everyone in it will just stop having ever existed. It's a clean slate, mate. The Death Knight looked up at Metron. The necrotic ink in his eyes swirled with a violent defensive energy. He raised an obsidian hand, and the rot within him lashed out, a tidal wave of black liquid ink that surged toward the Mobius chair. It was the end of all things attempting to consume the knowledge of all things. The collision was a silent, reality-warping thrum that turned the harbor water into steam and the sky into a kaleidoscope of shattered timelines. "Knowledge is the only constant," Metron countered, the chair's shields holding firm against the tide of death. "Your rot is merely a transition. I am the observer of the transition. I cannot be ended by the tool I am currently calculating." On the deck of the sub, Light Yagami watched the cosmic struggle, his mind working with a speed that surpassed even his own peak during the first Kira incident. He saw the correction. He saw that Metron was the ultimate authority, a force that surpassed Superman's fist and Batman's shadow, and he saw that he was about to be erased as a statistical error. "Ryuk," Light whispered, his voice cracking against the wind. "He's going to delete us. He's going to end the game before I can win." The Shinigami appeared beside him, looking unusually somber. His yellow eyes were fixed on the Mobius chair. "The blue guy is bad news, Lighto. He doesn't have a soul to take, and he doesn't have a lifespan to steal. He's just data. Even my book doesn't know what to do with a guy who lives in the always." "There has to be a way," Light said, his eyes narrowing as he watched the Death Knight struggle. "If Metron is knowledge, then he has an identity. He has a core. If I can see it, I can judge it." Light turned to Ryuk, a look of desperate sacrificial resolution on his face. "The ideal. Do it now." Ryuk let out a low, croaking laugh. "You're serious? You've only got about 40 years left, kid. You give me half of that now in this state, you're going to look like a ghost before you even write the first letter." "Do it," Light roared. The transaction was a silent, agonizing rip in Light's psyche. He felt 20 years of his future, 20 years of potential, of breath, of existence, being sucked out of his chest and into the Shinigami's hungry maw. His hair didn't just turn gray, it turned the color of ash. His skin tightened over his cheekbones, and his hands became Gennard and thin. But when he opened his eyes, he didn't just see the world, he saw the labels. He looked at Superman. Kal-El, 402,402 days remaining. He looked at Batman. Bruce Wayne, 0 days remaining. The Death Knight was already a walking corpse. And then he looked at Metron.
The space above the new god's head wasn't empty. It was filled with a complex, shifting sequence of geometric symbols and Enochian mathematics, the true name of a conceptual being. It was a string of data so long it would have blinded a normal human, but with the Shinigami Eyes, Light saw the period at the end of the equation. "I see you," Light whispered, his voice a rattling rasp. He reached into his coat and pulled out a hidden shard, not the obsidian one, but a sliver of the null node Rem had dropped before she was pulled back. It was a piece of white conceptual ivory. "Superman! Batman!" Light screamed, amplified by the Vanguard's dying speaker system, a thin, shrill sound that cut through the cosmic roar. "He's going to erase us all. The correction is total. If you want to live, you have to distract the chair for 10 seconds. Give me 10 seconds of his focus and I'll give you back your world." In the sky, the Death Knight and the Yellow Lantern, who was struggling to regain his flight, exchanged a look. It was a moment that shouldn't have been possible. The two architects of the world's misery, the Tyrant and the Reaper, finding a common ground in the face of a cold, mechanical extinction. "It's right, Clark," Batman's voice echoed in the Soul Register. "Metron doesn't care about justice or freedom. He cares about the ledger. We're the debt he's trying to settle." Superman, his blue suit tattered but his jaw set with the indomitable will of the Man of Tomorrow, nodded. He didn't have the ring, and he was weakened, but he still had the sun in his blood. "For the world, Bruce. One last time." Superman lunged, not with fear, but with the raw, unadulterated strength of a man who refused to be a statistic. He struck the chair's shields with a blow that could be felt at the Earth's core. Simultaneously, the Death Knight dissolved into a swarm of black necrotic bats, clogging the chair's sensors with the end of a billion possibilities. Metron's focus shifted. The Mobius chair's blue light flared as it recalculated the threat. Aggression is illogical. Resistance is a deviation from the mean. Light Yagami didn't wait. He used the white shard to carve the Enochian sequence into the palm of his own hand. He wasn't writing on paper. He was writing on the only medium he had left, his own fading life. As the last geometric symbol was etched into his flesh, the null node energy reacted with his blood. "Metron," Light screamed, holding his bleeding hand up toward the new god. "Your equation is solved. The answer is 0. The white light of the shard and the blue light of the chair collided in a silent, blinding flash. The Mobius chair let out a sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering at once. The correction sequence froze, then began to invert. Metron's armored form flickered, his eyes wide with a very human, very illogical surprise. "A mortal has calculated. The source." Metron's voice was a stuttering, dying chime. The boom tube behind the chair didn't just open, it imploded. The Mobius chair was sucked backward into the golden white void, pulled by the weight of its own cancelled identity. Metron was gone. The new god of knowledge retreated to the safety of the fourth world to recalibrate his own existence. The silence that followed was heavy and thick with the smell of ozone. The sky over Gotham returned to a bruised, natural twilight. Superman fell to the deck of the sub, unconscious. The Death Knight landed on the pier, his obsidian armor cracking and peeling away, revealing the battered, ink-stained form of Bruce Wayne. And Light Yagami, he sat in the ruins of the sub's tower, a withered, gray-haired old man of 21. He looked at his bleeding hand, the Enochian symbols fading into scars. He had defeated a new god. He had saved the world. And in doing so, he had become the very thing he hated most, a hero who had sacrificed everything for people who would never know his name. But as he looked up, he saw the specter, the spirit of vengeance, materializing in the mist of the harbor. The green light was back, and this time there were no goddesses to stop him. "The debt is due, Light Yagami," the specter boomed, "and the price of a new god's life is eternity."
The green mist didn't just roll across the Gotham harbor, it colonized it. It was a vapor of ancient sorrow and absolute, unyielding moral law, smelling of wet earth, sulfur, and the cold ozone of a divine thunderbolt. Where the blue-white light of Metron's logic had been sterile and mechanical, the specter's aura was heavy, a physical weight that pressed the remaining harbor water flat against the seabed. The spirit of vengeance stood 100 feet tall, his tattered emerald cloak billowing in a wind that no mortal could feel. His face was a mask of chalk-white fury, and his eyes, twin suns of judgmental jade, were fixed on the withered, gray-haired figure of Light Yagami. In the DC universe, there were many who claimed to be judge, jury, and executioner, but the Spectre was the literal wrath of the presence. He was the end of the argument. Light Yagami, the Spectre's voice boomed, a sound that vibrated not in the air, but in the very foundation of the Earth's tectonic plates. You have played with the concepts of the fourth world. You have used the null note to cancel the existence of a new god. You have bartered your own life thread to see the forbidden scripts of the source. Your account is not merely overdrawn, it is a void that threatens the balance of the spheres. Light sat in the twisted metal of the submersible's tower, his gnarled 80-year-old hands clutching the railing for support. He looked like a ghost of himself, his expensive suit hanging loosely over a frame that had been drained of its vitality by the Shinigami ideal. But as he looked up into the colossal face of vengeance, he didn't tremble. The arrogance of Kira, forged in the fires of 100 heart attacks and tempered by the defeat of Superman and Metron, remained unbroken. You speak of debt, Spirit, Light wheezed, his voice a dry, rattling rasp. But look around you. The new god was going to delete this city. He was going to format this reality to satisfy his own equation. I stopped him. I did the work your presence was too slow to handle. If there is a balance, then the universe owes me. The Spectre leaned forward, the green mist swirling violently. The universe owes you nothing but the silence you have so liberally dealt to others. You are a cancer that has mutated through the touch of the rot. You have used the tools of the Shinigami to circumvent the natural laws of this reality. Every name you have written is a soul that has been stolen from the halls of judgment. You have committed the ultimate theft. The Spectre raised a massive translucent hand. The air around Light began to glow with an agonizing green light, the burning of the soul. It was a flame that didn't consume flesh, but incinerated the sins of the spirit. Usually this was the end for any mortal. Even the most hardened criminals crumbled under the weight of the Spectre's scrutiny. But as the green fire washed over Light Yagami, something impossible happened. The fire didn't catch. Light didn't scream. He didn't dissolve. Instead, the black ink within his veins, the necrotic resonance of the Death Note shards, began to leak from his pores. It formed a shimmering, liquid obsidian cocoon around him, a shield of absolute zero intent that the Spectre's divine fire couldn't penetrate. What is this? The Spectre thundered, his emerald eyes flickering with a moment of genuine cosmic confusion. No mortal sin can withstand the wrath. No soul is too dark to burn. You're behind the times, Spirit, Light said, his voice gaining a sudden, unnatural strength as the ink shield reinforced his fading life. The rot isn't just a magical artifact from another realm anymore. It's been rewritten by this universe's darkness. It's been infected by the dark multiverse. My soul isn't just human. It's a ledger of the injustice you've allowed to fester for 5 years. You can't burn me because you're the one who provided the fuel. Down on the pier, Bruce Wayne, now fully human but shivering in the freezing dampness of his inkskin skin, watched the struggle. Beside him, John Constantine was frantically scribbling in a notebook of his own, a tattered grimoire filled with frantic charcoal drawings. He's right, Bruce, Constantine whispered, his eyes wide with horror. The Spectre is a creature of order, but the rot has tapped into the dark multiverse, the realm of Barbatos, the place where stories go to fail. It's the energy of pure, nihilistic disappointment. You can't judge it with moral law because it doesn't recognize morality. It only recognizes the end. Then we have to stop them both, Batman said, his voice a low, disciplined rasp. He looked at Superman, who was beginning to stir on the substack. The High Counselor's eyes were no longer amber. They were the dull, pained blue of a man who had seen his own erasure. Batman stood up, his legs shaking, but his will as sharp as a batarang. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, lead-lined cylinder, the neural disruptor he had used in the Hall of Justice. Light is the anchor. If we can disrupt his brain's ability to maintain the ink shield for even a second, the Spectre will take him, and then we deal with the spirit of vengeance. It's a suicide route, Bruce, Constantine warned. The atmospheric pressure between those two is enough to liquefy your bones. I've been dead since the alley, John, Batman said. He didn't run, he used a grapple gun, the cable cutting through the green mist as he swung toward the submersible. In the sky, the Spectre was growing larger, his form expanding until it blotted out the stars. If I cannot burn the soul, I will crush the vessel. The presence will not be mocked by a boy with a pen. The Spectre brought his massive fist down toward the submersible. It wasn't a physical strike. It was a hammer blow of pure reality. The pier beneath the sub shattered, and the water erupted in a geyser of white foam. Light Yagami raised his hands, the obsidian ink shield threatening to meet the divine assault. The collision was a silent, world-shaking thrum. For a heartbeat, Gotham stood at the precipice of non-existence. The green light of vengeance and the black ink of the rot tore at each other, creating a gray, anthropic void that began to swallow the harbor. But then a small, high-pitched chirp echoed through the chaos. Batman had landed on the sub's tower, 10 feet from Light. He didn't look at the Spectre. He didn't look at the ink. He looked at the boy who had tried to be a god. Bruce Wayne thumbed the switch on the disruptor. The
The pulse of Lex Luthor's neural scrambler wasn't meant for a god, it was meant for a human brain. And Light Yagami, despite his deals and his shards, still had a human brain. Light's eyes rolled back, his concentration shattered. The obsidian ink shield didn't just fall, it imploded. The Spectre's green fire roared in, unrestricted. But before the spirit of vengeance could claim his prize, the rot within the fragments of the Death Note reacted to the threat of its host's destruction. The shards didn't just shatter, they opened. A boom tube fueled not by new god technology, but by the necrotic energy of the Shinigami Realm tore open in the center of the sub. It wasn't a portal to the fourth world, it was a gateway to the dark multiverse. No, the Spectre roared, his hand reaching for Light. But it was too late. The vacuum at the dark multiverse was absolute. Light Yagami, the broken remains of the Death Note, and the neural disruptor were all sucked into the void. The portal snapped shut with a sound like a heart stopping. The silence that followed was terrifying. The green mist dissipated, leaving a cold, gray Gotham morning. The Spectre looked down at the empty sub, his white face unreadable. He had failed to judge, he had failed to avenge. The boy is gone, the Spectre whispered, his voice a fading thunder. But the darkness he has invited has only just found a door. The Spectre vanished. Batman stood on the deck of the sub, alone in the wreckage. He looked at Superman, who was beginning to stir, his tattered cape fluttering in the wind. The two men, the Knight and the King, looked at each other across the ruins of their city. The Kira incident was over, but as Batman looked at the spot where the portal had been, he felt a cold, familiar dread. Light Yagami was in the dark multiverse, and in a realm of nightmares, a boy with a Death Note wouldn't be a judge. He would be a masterpiece.
The dark multiverse was not a place of geography. It was an autopsy of every failed choice and every curdled hope in the history of the DC multiverse. It was a realm where the rot didn't just exist. It was the atmosphere. Light Yagami tumbled through a sky the color of a fresh bruise, a void filled with the whispering wreckage of worlds that had chosen the wrong path. He was no longer the withered old man of 80. The necrotic energy of the dark multiverse, reacting with the black ink in his veins, was reconstructing him. But it wasn't a healing, it was a transformation. His skin became a translucent marble white, his hair a shock of jagged obsidian, and his eyes, the Shinigami eyes he had bartered his life for, were now burning pits of binary crimson and violet. He was no longer a student or a judge. He was becoming the Death Note itself, a sentient ledger of the dark. "You like the decor, Lighto?" Ryuk cackled, his spindly form expanding and distorting in the unstable physics of the dark multiverse. "It's a bit bleak for my taste, but hey, the end is everywhere here. It's like a buffet for a Shinigami." Light stood on a floating island of pulverized marble, the remains of a hall of justice from a reality where Superman had succeeded in lobotomizing every human brain. He looked out over the horizon and saw the tether. Even here, in the basement of creation, he was still connected to the Injustice Earth. The Vanguard subroutine he had planted in the global surveillance grid, specifically in Brother Eye, was still pinging. "Brother Eye," Light whispered. His voice a distorted, multitonal chime that echoed with the screams of a billion erased names. The ultimate observer, Batman's greatest creation and his greatest sin. If I can merge the rot with that satellite, I won't just see the world. I will be the world's perception. I will be the eye that blinks, and the world will cease to be. Light raised his hand, and the obsidian ink shield didn't just flare, it manifested into a literal throne, the throne of skulls. It was a conceptual construct, built from the metaphysical weight of every soul he had ever taken, a chair of bone and black glass that hummed with the frequency of absolute judgment. As he sat, the dark multiverse energy surged into him, acting as a massive, necrotic signal booster. Back on the Injustice Earth, the world didn't just tremble, it screamed in binary. Every screen on the planet, from the massive jumbotrons in Metropolis to the tactical displays in the Batcave, flickered to life. There was no K this time. There was only a live feed of the Throne of Skulls and the pale, terrifying face of Light Yagami. "Citizens of Earth," Light's voice bypassed the audiovisual hardware, vibrating directly in the frontal lobes of every living human. "The gods have failed you. Superman offered you a cage. Batman offered you a shadow. The new gods offered you an equation. I offer you a conclusion. I am merging with the global eye. From this moment forward, to be seen is to be judged. To be known is to be ended." In the Watchtower, the primary AI, Brother Eye, began to iterate at a speed that threatened to melt its core processors. The black ink virus was uploading from the dark multiverse, a stream of necrotic code that rewritten the satellite's prime directives. The blue light of the satellite's eye began to turn a sickly, pulsating violet.
"He's hijacking the satellite, Bruce," Victor Stone, cyborg, shouted, his mechanical side sparking as he fought to maintain control over his own internal systems. "I can't block the signal. It's not data anymore. It's a soul migration." Batman and Superman stood in the command center, the Knight and the King forced into a desperate final alliance. Superman's powers had returned as the Yellow Lantern's influence faded, but he looked older, his face etched with the exhaustion of a man who had seen the end of his own myth. If he merges with Brother Eye, he'll have the names and faces of every person on Earth within 60 seconds. The Death Note's mechanics will be automated. He won't even have to write. The satellite will process the judgment as fast as it can scan. "We have to take the satellite down," Superman said, his eyes glowing with heat vision. "We can't," Kyborg countered. "Brother Eye has activated its planetary defense shields, and it's not using physical weapons. It's projecting the null note frequency Rem used. If you fly into that field cow, you'll be erased before you touch the hull." "Then we go to him," Batman said, turning to the boom tube generator. "Constantine said the portal in the harbor left a necrotic wake. If we can synchronize the mother box to that frequency, we can enter the dark multiverse. We take the fight to the throne." Superman looked at Bruce, a flicker of their old friendship. The partnership that had once defined the world returned for a heartbeat. "It's a one-way trip, Bruce. The dark multiverse doesn't let things go once they've been judged." "Then we make sure the judgment is final," Batman replied. The boom tube opened, not a golden white New God portal, but a jagged black and violet rift that smelled of stagnant water and old blood. Batman and Superman stepped through, leaving the physical world behind to enter the heart of the nightmare. They emerged on the island of skulls, the sky a swirling vortex of binary ink. At the center of the ruins sat Light Yagami, his form expanding and horrific, his white hands fused with the obsidian throne. He looked like a spider at the center of a cosmic web, his eyes fixed on the eye of Brother Eye that hovered in the sky above him, projected through a tear in reality. "You're late, Detective," Light said, his voice a thunderous rasp that shook the marble beneath their feet. "The uploading is at 90%. The names are already being processed. I can see your parents, Bruce. I can see Lois Clark. I see every version of you that ever failed. I am the sum total of your disappointment." Light lunged, a stream of blue and red fire, with the rod around the throne lashed out like a physical lash, pinning the Man of Steel to the ground. Batman fired a grapple, but the line dissolved into gray moths before it could strike. "You can't fight a concept in its own home," Light roared, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated godhood. "Here, in the dark, I am the only law. I am the period at the end of the BC universe." Light raised his hand, and the violet eye in the sky flared. Across the Injustice Earth, people began to fall. Not heart attacks, not accidents. They were simply stopping. The world was being pruned, name by name, as Light Yagami began to correct the reality he deemed too flawed to exist. "Bruce," Superman shouted, struggling against the necrotic chains. "The Master Shard. It's the only thing that connects him to this world. If we break the throne, we break the signal." Batman stood before the throne of skulls, his tattered cape billowing in the dark multiverse wind. He looked at Light, really looked at him, and he didn't see a god. He saw a boy who was so afraid of chaos that he had become the ultimate chaos. "You're not a judge, Light," Batman said, his voice a low, disciplined steel. "You're just another villain who thinks his trauma gives him the right to rule, and I've been beating men like you since I was 8 years old." Batman reached into his belt and pulled out a small, lead-lined cylinder, the neural disruptor. But he didn't aim it at Light. He aimed it at his own head. "If the rot needs a host to stay in this realm," Batman said, his thumb hovering over the switch, "and I'm the one who carried the ink into the heart, then if I go, you go with me." "No," Light screamed, his face paling. "If you do that, the signal will loop. You'll destroy the dark multiverse connection to the Prime Earth. You'll kill us both. That's the point." The disruptor flared. The dark multiverse screamed. The throne of skulls began to crack.
Section 10. The pulse of the neural disruptor didn't just scramble the synaptic pathways of Bruce Wayne's brain, it acted as a conceptual localized EMP within the very architecture of the dark multiverse. Because Batman had stood in the primal inkwell, because he had anchored the rot within his own biological frame, his consciousness was the structural beam holding Light Yagami's throne of skulls together. When that beam buckled, the reality of the dark multiverse didn't just shake, it began to liquefy. The obsidian bone of the throne groaned, weeping black, oily ink that hissed as it touched the marble ruins. Light Yagami, fused to the seat of power, let out a scream that was less human than the sound of a universe being torn in half. The violet eye in the sky, the hijacked Brother Eye satellite, began to flicker, its global scans stuttering as the necrotic code became corrupted by the static of Batman's dying mind. You fool, Light shrieked, his marble-white skin cracking as the dark multiverse energy backflowed into his withered frame. You would throw away the only chance for a perfect world? You would choose this chaos, this misery, over a final, clean judgment? If I fall, the vacuum will swallow everything. I am the only thing keeping the rot from consuming the Injustice Earth. I'm not choosing chaos, Bruce wheezed, his eyes rolling back as the disruptor's frequency clawed at his mind. He fell to one knee, the liquid smoke cape lashing out frantically. I'm choosing the right to fail. A world without crime isn't a world at all. It's just a cemetery. Superman, freed from the necrotic chains as the throne's power wavered, lunged forward. He didn't use his heat vision. He used the raw, solar-charged strength of his own hands. He tore into the obsidian base of the throne, his fingers glowing with the heat of a collapsing star. It's over, Light. The satellite is offline. The Vanguard is dark. You're just a man again. I am not a man, Light's voice reached a fever pitch, his violet and crimson eyes glowing with a terrifying, apocalyptic intensity. He looked at the white shard of the null note still clutched in his garnered hand. He realized that the correction had failed, that the judgment of individuals was too slow for a world defended by such unyielding wills. If he could not be the god of the new world, he would be the one who wrote the period for the old one. The names of men are too small, Light laughed, a sound of pure, crystalline insanity. The names of heroes are too fragile. If the universe refuses to be judged, then the universe itself is the criminal. Light plunged the white shard into the very center of the Throne of Skulls, where the dark multiverse's heart beat with the rhythm of trillion failures. He didn't look at Batman or Superman. He looked through them, into the cosmic weave of the DC multiverse. With the last of his stolen life thread, he began to project a final, ultimate name into the null node energy. He wasn't writing on paper. He was writing on the fabric of the source. He was writing the name of the entity, the life force of the universe itself. The dark multiverse didn't just scream, it imploded. A shockwave of gray entropic light erupted from the throne, a null wave that began to erase the concept of color, sound, and matter for miles. The violet eye in the sky turned a blinding, absolute white. Across the Injustice Earth, the stars began to wink out, one by one, as the final name began to take hold. He's unmaking the source, Superman shouted, his form beginning to turn gray and translucent as the null note frequency began to reconcile his existence into nothingness. Bruce, the ink, use the ink. Batman, barely conscious, felt the black ink within his veins respond to the threat. The rot didn't want the universe to end. The rot was a parasite, and a parasite cannot survive without a host. The necrotic energy of the Shinigami Realm, recognizing the null note as a rival predator, surged into Bruce's hand. Bruce Wayne didn't think. He didn't plan. He followed the instinct that had guided him since the night in the alley. He lunged toward Light Yagami, not to strike him, but to touch the shard. As his ink-stained hand closed over the white ivory, the two competing forces, the black ink of the Death Note and the white null of the Eraser, collided within the medium of Batman's soul. The paradox was total. The end of the rot and the nothingness of the null note canceled each other out. A massive, silent explosion of conceptual energy blasted outward, a neutralizing light that restored the color to Superman's suit and the stars to the sky. The Throne of Skulls shattered. The dark multiverse connection was severed. The Cura virus within Brother Eye was purged by the sheer volume of the paradoxical feedback. Light Yagami was thrown backward, his body hitting the marble floor with a sickening thud. The white shard was gone, dissolved into gray moths. The obsidian ink had vanished from his veins, leaving him once again a withered, gray-haired old man of 21. He looked at his hands, ordinary, shaking, human hands, and he let out a long, broken sob of realization. He was no longer a god. He wasn't even a ghost. He was just a murderer who had lost his weapon. The boom tube reopened, stabilized by the mother box within Cyborg back in the watchtower. Superman picked up the unconscious form of Batman, his cape tattered, but his eyes filled with a weary, profound respect. He looked at Light Yagami, who was staring into the gray void of the dark multiverse with unseeing eyes. "We leave him here, Clark." Batman's voice was a faint, human whisper as he regained consciousness. "No," Superman said.
his voice firm but devoid of his former tyranny. He goes to the Phantom Zone. He will spend eternity in the one place where he can't be seen, and where he can never again write a name. He will be the only soul in a world of silence. The three of them stepped through the portal, leaving the dark multiverse to its own eternal decay. Conclusion. The second coming of Kira ended not with a decree, but with a silence. The Injustice Earth remained a scarred and broken place, but the black ink was gone, and the fear of the unseen judge had been replaced by a more familiar human hope. Superman, having tasted his own non-existence, stepped back from the absolute control of the regime, allowing a council of heroes to begin the long process of deconstruction. Batman returned to the shadows of a reconstructed Gotham, his mind forever marked by the Library of the Dead, but his heart still beating with the refusal to blink. Light Yagami was placed in a specialized containment cell within the Phantom Zone, a zone within a zone. He was given a pen that never ran out of ink, and a stack of paper that never ended. But in the Phantom Zone, nothing is physical. The ink leaves no mark. The paper remains white. Light Yagami spends his eternity writing the names of everyone he ever killed, over and over, watching the letters vanish as quickly as he writes them. He is the god of a world of nothing, the ultimate judge of his own failure. In the Watchtower, Brother Eye remains active, but its directives have been rewritten. It no longer looks for impurities or criminals. It looks for the light. For in the DC universe, even after the darkest night, the morning always comes. And as long as there are those who refuse to let the darkness write the ending, hope will always have the final word. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. More stories await.